Have you ever been in a situation where everyone was convinced you were guilty? Where fingers pointed at you from every direction? Where voices rose in accusation and condemnation, yet you chose to remain silent because you knew that the truth, your truth, would eventually speak louder than any defense you could offer in that moment of chaos and judgment? Well, let me tell you about the day my entire world turned upside down. The day when I became the villain in a story I never wanted to be part of, the day when my silence became both my burden and my salvation, and how a single question about one specific date changed everything in ways I could never have imagined. My name doesn't matter for this story, but what happened to me could happen to anyone, and I'm sharing this with you today because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is wait for the right moment to reveal our truth, even when every fiber of our being is screaming to defend ourselves against lies and misunderstandings that threaten to destroy everything we've built. This is my story of patience, pain, vindication, and the unexpected way justice can manifest when you least expect it. It all started 3 years ago when I was working at a mid-sized marketing firm in the city, a place where I had invested 5 years of my life, climbing from an entry-level position to becoming a senior account manager with a reputation for integrity and dedication that I had carefully cultivated through countless late nights, successful campaigns, and relationships built on trust and mutual respect. I loved my job, I truly did, because it wasn't just about the paycheck or the title on my business card. It was about the creative challenges, the team dynamics, the satisfaction of seeing a campaign succeed, and the sense of belonging I felt in an environment where I thought I had found my professional home. My colleague, let's call her Sarah, had joined the company about 2 years after me, and initially we had what I considered a friendly professional relationship, the kind where you share coffee breaks, exchange pleasantries about weekend plans, collaborate on projects without friction, and genuinely wish each other well in your respective career trajectories. She was talented, ambitious, driven by goals that seemed to align with the company's vision, and I had no reason to believe that beneath the surface of our cordial interactions, there was brewing a resentment I couldn't see, a jealousy I didn't recognize, and a plan that would eventually target me in the most devastating way possible. The dynamics at our firm were complex, as they are in any workplace where personalities clash, ambitions collide, and office politics play an invisible but powerful role in determining who rises and who falls in the corporate hierarchy. Our department consisted of 12 people, each with their own strengths, weaknesses, alliances, and aspirations that created an intricate web of relationships that could shift with every new project assignment or performance review. I had always tried to stay above the drama, focusing on my work rather than engaging in gossip or playing political games that seemed to consume so much energy from others who were more interested in perception than performance. But looking back now, I realize that my very refusal to engage in those games, my commitment to letting my work speak for itself, may have been perceived by some as arrogance or aloofness, when in reality, it was simply my way of maintaining professional boundaries and protecting my own mental health in an environment that could sometimes feel toxic, despite its outward appearance of collaboration and teamwork. The project that would become the center of everything was a major campaign for one of our biggest clients, a national retail chain that represented approximately 30% of our annual revenue, and had the potential to open doors to even larger opportunities if we delivered results that exceeded their expectations. I had been assigned as the lead account manager, which meant I was responsible for coordinating all aspects of the campaign, from initial strategy sessions to final implementation, managing timelines, budgets, team assignments, client communications, and ensuring that every element aligned with both the client's vision and our agency's creative standards. Sarah was assigned as the secondary manager, a role that involved supporting my efforts, taking on specific sub-projects, and being prepared to step in if I needed assistance or if the workload became too overwhelming for one person to handle effectively. At first, everything seemed to be going smoothly, with regular team meetings, clear communication channels, shared documents that kept everyone informed of progress and challenges, and a collaborative spirit that made me optimistic about our chances of delivering something truly exceptional that would strengthen our relationship with this crucial client. But then something shifted, something subtle that I didn't fully recognize at the time because I was so focused on the work itself. so consumed by deadlines and deliverables and the pressure of knowing that failure wasn't an option when so much was riding on the success of this particular campaign. Sarah began missing meetings, citing urgent matters that required her attention elsewhere, offering apologies that seemed sincere enough that I didn't question her commitment or suspect that anything was amiss beyond the normal chaos of juggling multiple responsibilities in a fast-paced agency environment. She would submit her portions of the work at the last possible moment, forcing me to review and integrate everything under time constraints that made thorough quality control difficult and stressful. When I raised concerns about this pattern in our one-on-one check-ins, she would become defensive, suggesting that I was micromanaging her, questioning her capabilities, not trusting her to do her job, which made me feel guilty for even bringing up issues that I thought were legitimate concerns about project management and team coordination, rather than personal criticisms of her abilities or work ethic. I started working longer hours to compensate for the gaps, taking on tasks that should have been shared responsibilities, staying late at the office to ensure that nothing fell through the cracks, sacrificing weekends and evenings with family and friends because I felt personally responsible for the success of this campaign and couldn't bear the thought of letting down my team, my boss, or most importantly, our client, who had placed their trust and significant financial investment in our agency's ability to deliver results. The stress was mounting. I could feel it in the tightness of my shoulders, the headaches that would strike in the middle of the afternoon, the difficulty falling asleep at night as my mind raced through checklists and contingency plans and worst-case scenarios that kept me awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was doing enough, if I was making the right decisions, if I was managing everything as effectively as I should be given my experience and position. Then came the incident that would change everything. The moment when the foundation I thought was solid beneath my feet suddenly crumbled, revealing cracks I hadn't known existed, and setting in motion a chain of events that would test everything I believed about justice, truth, and the importance of timing, in revealing information that could exonerate you or condemn you depending on when and how it was presented. It was a Thursday afternoon. I remember the exact day because of how vivid every detail remains in my memory, burned into my consciousness, with the kind of clarity that trauma sometimes creates, making you remember sensory details you wouldn't normally notice, like the smell of coffee brewing in the break room, the sound of keyboards clicking throughout the office, the particular quality of light streaming through the windows as the sun began its descent toward evening. Our creative director called an emergency meeting, his face grave with an expression I had never seen before, a mixture of disappointment and anger, and something else I couldn't quite identify but that made my stomach clench with immediate anxiety, even before I knew what the meeting was about. The entire team gathered in the main conference room, that glass-walled space where we had celebrated successes and weathered challenges together. But this time the atmosphere was different, heavy with an unspoken tension that made everyone uncomfortable as we took our seats around the long table, exchanging confused glances and whispered speculation about what could possibly require such an urgent gathering. Our creative director stood at the head of the table, his posture rigid with the kind of controlled anger that comes from trying to maintain professionalism while dealing with something that has personally offended or disappointed you on a fundamental level. He began speaking, his voice tight with barely contained frustration, explaining that he had received a complaint, a serious allegation that required immediate attention and could potentially jeopardize our relationship with the client we had all been working so hard to impress with this campaign that represented months of effort, creative energy, strategic planning, and hopes for future business that could elevate our agency to new heights of success and reputation within the industry. My heart was pounding as I listened, trying to understand what could possibly have gone wrong. What complaint could be serious enough to warrant this kind of dramatic confrontation? Who might have made such an allegation and why? And what it might mean for the project, for the team, for my career that I had built so carefully over these 5 years of dedication and hard work. Then he said my name, and the entire room seemed to shift, all eyes turning toward me with expressions ranging from shock to curiosity to what looked disturbingly like satisfaction on a few faces, as if some people had been waiting for me to fail, to stumble, to reveal some hidden flaw that would justify their own insecurities or resentments. He explained that Sarah had come to him with evidence, documentation that supposedly proved I had been embezzling funds from the campaign budget, inflating expenses, submitting false receipts, redirecting money that should have gone to legitimate campaign costs into my own personal accounts, through a scheme that she claimed to have uncovered through her diligent review of financial records and expense reports that I had been submitting over the past several months. The words hit me like physical blows, each accusation landing with stunning force that made it difficult to breathe, to think, to process what I was hearing because it was so completely divorced from reality, so utterly false and malicious that I couldn't immediately comprehend how anyone could make such claims, let alone someone I had worked alongside, someone I had trusted to be a professional colleague even if we weren't close personal friends. I sat there frozen, my mind racing through everything I had done, every expense I had submitted, every receipt I had carefully filed and documented according to company policy, every transaction that had been completely legitimate and necessary for the campaign we were executing. I knew with absolute certainty that I had done nothing wrong, that these accusations were false, that there must be some terrible misunderstanding or deliberate fabrication. But in that moment, with everyone staring at me, with the creative director's disappointed gaze burning into me, with Sarah sitting across the table looking convincingly distressed and concerned, as if she genuinely regretted having to bring this information forward, but felt morally obligated to expose my supposed wrongdoing, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I chose to remain silent, not because I didn't have things to say, not because I accepted the accusations, but because I realized that anything I said in that heated moment, any defense I offered while emotions were running high and judgment had already begun to form in people's minds, would likely be dismissed as the desperate protestations of someone caught in their own web of deception. The silence stretched out, becoming increasingly uncomfortable as everyone waited for me to respond, to deny the allegations, to provide some explanation that would make sense of what Sarah was claiming. But I simply sat there, maintaining eye contact with the creative director, keeping my expression as neutral as possible despite the storm of emotions churning inside me, the rage and betrayal and fear and disbelief all competing for dominance, while I fought to maintain some semblance of composure and dignity. My silence seemed to confirm their suspicions in their minds. I could see it in their faces, the way they looked at each other, the subtle nods, the resigned expressions that suggested they had expected me to lie or make excuses but were almost relieved that I wasn't even trying to defend myself, as if my silence was an admission of guilt, rather than a strategic choice to wait for the right moment to address these accusations with the care and evidence they deserved. The meeting ended with instructions that I was to be placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation into the allegations, that I should gather my personal belongings and leave the office, that I would be contacted about next steps in the process, and that I should not attempt to contact any team members or access company systems until the matter was resolved. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in that room following me as I walked out, my legs somehow carrying me through movements that felt mechanical and disconnected from my consciousness, as if I was watching myself from outside my body, observing this nightmare unfold without being fully present in the experience. I collected my things from my desk, a few personal items that suddenly seemed meaningless in the face of what was happening, photographs and coffee mugs and the small plant I had kept alive for 3 years that now seemed like relics from a life that was already slipping away from me with terrifying speed. Walking out of that office, feeling the weight of judgment and suspicion following me like a physical presence, knowing that my reputation was being shredded behind my back, even as I maintained the dignity of silence, was one of the hardest things I've ever experienced in my professional life. The elevator ride down to the ground floor seemed to take forever, each floor passing with agonizing slowness while I stood there alone with my box of belongings, my mind already beginning to work through the implications of what had just happened, the career damage, the financial uncertainty, the personal relationships that would be strained or destroyed by these accusations, the fundamental unfairness of being condemned without evidence or due process, or even the opportunity to defend myself in any meaningful way. Have you ever been falsely accused of something so serious that it threatened to destroy everything you had worked for? Comment below because I want to hear your stories, your experiences with injustice, and how you handled the emotional weight of being presumed guilty when you knew in your heart that you had done nothing wrong. The days that followed were some of the darkest of my life, a period of isolation and uncertainty that tested my mental health and emotional resilience in ways I had never experienced before, and hope never to experience again. I stayed home, unable to face the outside world, checking my phone obsessively for updates from the company, for messages from colleagues that never came, for some indication that someone believed in me or was willing to listen to my side of the story before passing judgment. The silence from people I had considered friends was perhaps the most painful aspect of the entire experience. The realization that relationships I thought were built on mutual respect and trust could evaporate so quickly when faced with serious accusations, as if years of working together, sharing successes and challenges, supporting each other through difficult projects and personal struggles, meant nothing when weighed against unproven allegations and the human tendency to believe the worst about people when presented with compelling narratives of wrongdoing. I spent hours reviewing my own records, pulling up every expense report I had submitted, every receipt I had saved, every email documenting budget decisions and expenditures, building a comprehensive file of evidence that would prove my innocence once I was given the opportunity to present it. But as I worked through this documentation, something began to emerge that I hadn't fully recognized before. Patterns and discrepancies that suggested a more complex situation than I had initially understood. I noticed that many of the expenses Sarah claimed were falsified had actually been submitted by her, using my name and approval but on dates when I had been out of the office, when I had been traveling for client meetings or taking rare vacation days that were documented in my calendar and confirmed by travel receipts and email timestamps that provided undeniable proof of my whereabouts. The realization hit me like a revelation, like pieces of a puzzle suddenly falling into place to reveal a picture I hadn't been able to see when looking at individual elements in isolation. Sarah hadn't just discovered evidence of embezzlement, she had created it, systematically and deliberately over months, building a case against me while I was too focused on the work, too trusting of a colleague, too naive about the depths of ambition and jealousy that could drive someone to destroy another person's career and reputation for personal gain. The anger I felt in that moment was different from the initial shock and hurt. It was colder, more focused, accompanied by a determination to not just clear my name but to expose the truth in a way that would be undeniable and comprehensive, leaving no room for doubt or continued suspicion. But I also knew that timing would be everything, that presenting this evidence too early, before the company had completed its investigation, before all the facts had been gathered by neutral parties, might actually work against me if it appeared that I was trying to manipulate the process or deflect blame onto someone else in a desperate attempt to save myself. So I continued to wait, continued to gather evidence, continued to document everything with meticulous care, creating a timeline that showed not just what had happened, but how it had been orchestrated, who had access to what systems, at what times, whose digital fingerprints were actually on the suspicious transactions despite my name being attached to them in the official records. The call came 3 weeks after that devastating meeting. 3 weeks of living in limbo, of explaining to my family what was happening while trying to shield them from the full emotional impact of being accused of criminal behavior, of lying awake at night wondering if justice would actually prevail or if I would become another casualty of workplace politics and calculated betrayal. The company's HR director informed me that they had completed their initial investigation and wanted to proceed with formal mediation, a process that would involve me, Sarah, our supervisors, and a professional mediator brought in from outside the company to ensure impartiality and proper handling of what had become a serious dispute with potential legal ramifications for all parties involved. Mediation was scheduled for the following Monday at a neutral location, a conference center downtown that specialized in corporate dispute resolution, a place designed to be neither intimidating nor comfortable, just functional and professional, in a way that was supposed to put all parties at ease and facilitate honest communication. I prepared for that meeting with the kind of intensity usually reserved for the most important presentations of my career, organizing my evidence, creating clear documentation, anticipating questions and accusations, preparing myself emotionally for what I knew would be a difficult and potentially confrontational process. The morning of mediation arrived with gray skies and a cold wind that seemed to match my internal state. A mixture of nervousness and determination, fear and righteous anger, exhaustion from weeks of stress and a strange energy that came from knowing that this was finally my opportunity to speak, to present the truth, to fight back against accusations that had already done so much damage to my professional reputation and personal well-being. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that projected professionalism and confidence even though inside I felt fragile and vulnerable. aware that every aspect of my presentation, from my appearance to my demeanor to the way I responded to questions, would be scrutinized and interpreted by people who had already formed opinions about my guilt or innocence. The mediation room was exactly what you would expect. A large rectangular space with a conference table, uncomfortable chairs designed for functionality rather than comfort, bland artwork on the walls that was probably meant to be calming, but just felt sterile and impersonal, fluorescent lighting that cast everything in a harsh brightness that left no shadows, no places to hide, just stark exposure of everyone present. Sarah was already there when I arrived, sitting on one side of the table with our creative director and the HR director, her expression carefully composed into something that looked like reluctant concern, as if she was troubled by having to be there, as if this whole situation was as distressing for her as it was for me, when I knew with certainty that she had orchestrated every element of this nightmare for reasons I still couldn't fully comprehend. The mediator was a woman in her 50s, gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, glasses perched on her nose, an air of professional neutrality that seemed both comforting and intimidating at the same time. Someone who had clearly seen countless workplace disputes and brought a kind of weary wisdom to the process that suggested she wouldn't be easily fooled by emotional appeals or obvious lies. She introduced herself, explained the mediation process, outlined the ground rules for our discussion, emphasized the importance of honesty and respect, and reminded us that the goal was not to assign blame, but to understand what had happened and find a resolution that would be fair to all parties involved. Though I couldn't help but think that fairness had been absent from this entire situation, from the moment Sarah had made her accusations without any real evidence or investigation into the truth. Sarah presented her case first, speaking in a voice that trembled with what seemed like genuine emotion, describing how she had discovered irregularities in the expense reports, how she had agonized over what to do with this information, how she had tried to give me the benefit of the doubt but the evidence was simply too overwhelming to ignore, how she felt betrayed by someone she had trusted and respected, how difficult it was for her to come forward knowing it would damage my career but feeling morally obligated to protect the company and our client from financial fraud. She presented printouts of expense reports, highlighted sections that she claimed showed inflated costs and falsified receipts, pointed to transactions that she insisted could only have been authorized by me given my role as lead account manager, built a narrative that seemed compelling on the surface if you didn't look too closely at the actual evidence or question the assumptions underlying her accusations. I sat there listening, maintaining the same silence I had chosen in that initial meeting, watching the mediator take notes, observing the expressions of the others in the room as they heard Sarah's presentation, seeing the skepticism in some faces and the certainty in others, knowing that my moment would come but that I needed to be patient, to wait for the right opportunity, to trust that the process would eventually reveal the truth if I approached it strategically rather than emotionally. The silence was harder now than it had been before because now I had to sit there listening to lies presented as truth, had to watch someone I had worked alongside construct a false narrative designed to destroy me while I remained passive, appearing to have no defense. No response. Nothing to say in my own defense, which must have seemed strange to everyone in that room who expected me to be frantically trying to explain myself or poke holes in Sarah's story. The mediator turned to me after Sarah finished, her expression professionally neutral but with a hint of curiosity in her eyes, probably wondering why I hadn't interrupted or objected or shown more visible reaction to such serious accusations. She asked if I wanted to respond to what had been presented, if I had evidence or testimony that would address the allegations, if there was anything I wanted to say about the situation before we moved forward with questions and discussion. I opened my mouth to speak, ready to finally break my silence to present the evidence I had so carefully prepared, to begin dismantling Sarah's false narrative piece by piece. But then the mediator held up her hand, a gesture that stopped me mid-breath, and said something that changed everything in an instant. A question so simple and yet so devastatingly perfect in its implications that I knew immediately this was the moment I had been waiting for, the opportunity to reveal the truth in a way that would be undeniable and complete. She looked directly at Sarah, her eyes sharp with the kind of professional scrutiny that comes from years of experience detecting inconsistencies and lies in mediation settings, and asked a question that seemed innocuous on the surface but that I recognized immediately as the key that would unlock everything I had discovered in my weeks of investigation, and documentation. The mediator asked Sarah to clarify a specific date mentioned in one of the expense reports she had presented as evidence, a date that appeared on a receipt for what Sarah claimed was an inflated vendor payment that I had supposedly authorized for personal gain, asking Sarah to explain the circumstances of that transaction, who was present, where I had been when the authorization was supposedly given, whether she had any direct knowledge of how that particular expense had been processed and approved. I watched Sarah's face as the question registered, saw the momentary flash of panic in her eyes before she recovered her composure, noticed the slight hesitation before she began to answer, the way her voice became just a fraction less certain as she explained that she didn't have specific memory of that particular date, but that the documentation clearly showed my authorization and approval, that she had simply been doing her due diligence in reviewing financial records and had found this along with other concerning transactions that followed a similar pattern. But the mediator wasn't satisfied with that answer. She pressed further, asking Sarah why she had chosen to highlight this particular expense report as evidence when there were others that might have been more clear-cut examples of the fraud she was alleging. What made this specific transaction noteworthy enough to include in her presentation, whether she had verified the date and circumstances before making accusations based on this documentation. The date in question was October 15th of the previous year, and as the mediator continued to focus on this specific detail, I felt a surge of gratitude for whatever instinct or experience had led her to zero in on this particular piece of evidence, because October 15th was the day that would prove everything I had suspected, the day that would unravel Sarah's entire fabricated case, the day that would vindicate me in a way that was undeniable and complete. I had been in Tokyo on October 15th, leading a presentation for a potential client, a trip that had been approved weeks in advance, documented in company travel records, confirmed by airline tickets and hotel reservations, and meeting schedules that left no doubt about my whereabouts on that specific date. More importantly, the expense report in question had been submitted through the company system using my login credentials, but from an IP address that was traced to the office, at a time when I was provably 35,000 feet in the air somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, making it physically impossible for me to have authorized or approved anything at that time. I had discovered this discrepancy during my weeks of investigation, along with several other similar instances where expenses had been processed using my credentials when I was demonstrably away from the office, but I had been waiting for the right moment to present this information, knowing that the impact would be greatest if it emerged naturally through the mediation process rather than appearing as a desperate attempt on my part to shift blame. And now the mediator had inadvertently created that perfect moment by focusing on this specific date, by asking questions that would force Sarah to either admit her deception or dig herself deeper into lies that could be easily disproven with objective evidence that left no room for interpretation or doubt. I maintained my expression of calm attention, but inside I was preparing to finally speak, to finally break the silence that had defined this entire nightmare, to finally present the truth that would not only clear my name but expose the calculated betrayal that had been orchestrated against me by someone who had apparently decided that destroying my career was worth whatever benefit she hoped to gain from my downfall. The mediator turned to me, perhaps sensing that something significant was about to be revealed, perhaps recognizing from my expression that I had been waiting for exactly this moment, and asked me directly if I had any information about my whereabouts on October 15th, any documentation that might be relevant to understanding how the expense in question had been processed and approved. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for, the opportunity to not just defend myself but to reveal the entire truth in a way that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. I reached for the folder I had brought with me, thick with evidence and documentation, organized with tabs and highlights and notes that would make everything clear and undeniable, and I began to speak for the first time since these accusations had begun, my voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface, determined to present the facts clearly and comprehensively so there could be no confusion about what had really happened. I explained that on October 15th I had been in Tokyo, that I had departed on October 13th and returned on October 17th, that every moment of that trip was documented and verifiable through multiple independent sources including airline records, hotel stays, meeting schedules, and even social media posts and photos that I had shared during that time. I presented my flight itinerary, showing the exact times of departure and arrival, The hours spent in transit that made it impossible for me to have been in the office submitting expense reports or authorizing transactions. I showed emails sent from my Tokyo hotel, messages exchanged with colleagues about the client presentation, photographs time-stamped and geotagged that proved my location beyond any shadow of doubt. And then I presented the most damning evidence, the server logs from our company's expense management system that showed the exact IP address and timestamp of when that October 15th expense report had been submitted, an IP address that traced directly to the office network at a time when I was provably on a plane over the Pacific Ocean, making it physically impossible for me to have been the person who submitted that report, despite it bearing my login credentials and digital signature. The room fell silent as the implications of what I was presenting became clear to everyone present. The realization that if I couldn't have submitted that expense report, then someone else must have used my credentials to do so. Someone who had access to my login information. Someone who knew enough about the system to forge my approval. Someone who had deliberately created false evidence to support accusations of fraud and embezzlement. I continued speaking, maintaining my composure even as I saw Sarah's face drain of color, even as I noticed the HR director and creative director exchanging glances that suggested they were beginning to understand the magnitude of what had actually occurred. I explained that October 15th was not an isolated incident, that I had discovered multiple other instances where expenses had been processed using my credentials when I was demonstrably away from the office or out of reach of the system, creating a pattern that could not be explained by accident or system error, but only by deliberate manipulation by someone who had both access and motive to frame me for financial crimes I had never committed. I presented additional evidence, showing that many of the expenses Sarah had flagged as suspicious had actually been legitimate campaign costs that had been approved through proper channels, documented with valid receipts and supporting materials, justified by the needs of the project and within the approved budget parameters. But more significantly, I showed that several of the supposedly inflated or fraudulent expenses had been initiated by Sarah herself, submitted through the system with my name attached but traceable through audit logs to her workstation, her computer, her unique digital fingerprints that she had apparently believed were hidden or untraceable, but that a thorough investigation of system records revealed with damning clarity. The picture that emerged was not of my malfeasance but of Sarah's calculated campaign to destroy my reputation, while simultaneously embezzling funds herself, using my credentials to cover her tracks, creating a paper trail that pointed to me, while she enriched herself with money that should have gone to legitimate campaign expenses. The mediator asked Sarah directly if she had any explanation for these discrepancies, any reason why expense reports would show my authorization from times and locations where I could not possibly have been present, any innocent explanation for why her workstation appeared in audit logs associated with transactions she had claimed I alone had processed. Sarah's response was weak, stammering, full of vague suggestions about system errors and shared computers, and the possibility that someone else might have used her workstation, explanations that crumbled under even the gentlest scrutiny from the mediator who had clearly seen enough to understand what had really happened. The creative director and HR director were no longer looking at me with suspicion or disappointment. Their expressions had shifted to something between shock and anger as they realized they had been manipulated, that they had nearly destroyed the career of an innocent employee based on fabricated evidence, presented by someone who had proven to be both calculating and dishonest. What followed was swift and decisive. Sarah was immediately suspended pending a criminal investigation. The accusations against me were formally withdrawn with apologies that felt both sincere and inadequate given what I had endured, and I was offered reinstatement with full back pay and compensation for the damage to my reputation and the emotional distress I had suffered during those weeks of being presumed guilty without evidence or due process. The mediation ended with Sarah leaving the room escorted by security, her face a mask of defeat, and perhaps finally some genuine emotion as the consequences of her actions became inescapable and real. I sat there for a moment after everyone else had left, alone with the mediator who looked at me with an expression that might have been respect or sympathy, or simply professional acknowledgement of how well I had handled an impossible situation. She asked me why I had remained silent for so long, why I had endured weeks of suspicion and isolation, when I had evidence that could have cleared my name much earlier in the process, what had motivated me to wait, rather than immediately defending myself against such serious accusations. I told her the truth, that I had learned through experience that timing matters, that presenting evidence too early can seem defensive or manipulative, that allowing a process to unfold naturally while gathering comprehensive documentation often leads to more complete and undeniable vindication than rushing to defend yourself in the heat of initial accusations. I explained that I had wanted not just to clear my name but to ensure that the full truth emerged, that the person responsible for the actual wrongdoing was exposed, that justice was served in a way that left no room for doubt or lingering suspicion that might have followed me throughout my career if I had simply managed to create reasonable doubt about my own guilt, without proving what had really happened and who had really been behind the fraud. The aftermath of that mediation was complex and emotionally exhausting in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, even after everything I had already been through during those weeks of accusation and investigation. Returning to work was strange. Walking back into an office where everyone now knew what had happened, where I had gone from presumed criminal to vindicated victim in the span of a single meeting, where colleagues who had avoided me or whispered about me now wanted to apologize and explain that they had never really believed the accusations, but had felt powerless to say anything while the investigation was ongoing. I accepted their apologies with grace, even though I felt angry about how quickly they had been willing to believe the worst about me, even though I knew that some of them had probably enjoyed watching my fall from grace before the truth emerged to complicate their narratives and force them to reconsider their judgments. The company conducted a full audit of the campaign finances and discovered that Sarah had embezzled approximately $75,000 over the course of 8 months, using sophisticated methods to hide her theft, while simultaneously building a case against me that would deflect suspicion if anyone started asking questions about missing funds or budget discrepancies. She was ultimately prosecuted and convicted of fraud and embezzlement, sentenced to prison time and ordered to make restitution, though I knew that even full repayment of the stolen funds wouldn't undo the damage she had done to multiple people's lives and careers through her selfish and calculating actions. The client was informed of what had happened, and while they were initially concerned about the scandal and the potential impact on their campaign, they ultimately appreciated the transparency and the swift action taken by our agency to address the situation, and they chose to continue working with us, a decision that saved several jobs and allowed the agency to maintain its reputation despite the internal turmoil that had threatened to destroy everything. For me personally, the experience was transformative in ways both positive and negative, teaching me lessons about patience and strategy, about the importance of documentation and evidence, about the darkness that can exist in people you think you know and trust, about the fragility of reputation and how quickly years of hard work can be threatened by lies and manipulation. I became more cautious in my professional relationships, more aware of office politics and personal dynamics, more protective of my credentials and access to systems, more diligent about maintaining my own records and documentation of everything I did in case I ever needed to defend myself again. But I also became more confident in my ability to handle adversity, more certain that truth ultimately prevails if you have the patience and courage to wait for the right moment to reveal it, more appreciative of the few people who did stand by me during those dark weeks even when it wasn't easy or popular to do so. Looking back now from the perspective of 3 years later, I can see that experience as a turning point in my life and career, a crucible that tested me in ways I never expected, but that ultimately made me stronger, wiser, more resilient, and more committed to operating with integrity and transparency in everything I do. I learned that silence can be a powerful tool when used strategically, that sometimes the best defense is to gather evidence and wait for the right opportunity, rather than reacting emotionally in the moment, that justice may be slow, but it can be thorough and complete if you approach it with patience and preparation. I learned that accusations, no matter how serious or seemingly credible, are not the same as truth, and that maintaining your own certainty about your innocence even when everyone else seems convinced of your guilt is essential to surviving the emotional toll of being falsely accused. The question that Mediator asked about that one date, October 15th, became the hinge on which everything turned. The simple inquiry that unlocked the truth and revealed the elaborate deception that had nearly destroyed my career and reputation. It reminded me that sometimes the smallest details matter most, that one verifiable fact can unravel an entire web of lies, that patience and preparation and faith in the ultimate power of truth can lead to vindication in ways that are more complete and satisfying than any immediate defense could have achieved. That date became symbolic for me, A reminder of the day justice prevailed, the day my silence ended, the day I reclaimed my reputation and my career and my sense of self-worth that had been under assault for weeks. I want you to understand something important from my story, something that goes beyond the specific details of what happened to me and speaks to a larger truth about how we handle accusations, injustice, and the challenge of maintaining integrity when we're under attack from people who don't share our commitment to honesty and fairness. The temptation when you're falsely accused is to immediately defend yourself, to shout your innocence, to demand that people believe you, to become emotional and reactive in ways that can actually undermine your credibility and make you seem desperate or guilty. But sometimes, often even, the better approach is to stay calm, gather evidence, trust in the process, and wait for the right moment to present your defense in a way that is unassailable and complete, leaving no room for doubt or continued suspicion. This doesn't mean you should remain passive or accept injustice. It means being strategic about how you fight back, recognizing that timing and presentation matter, that evidence speaks louder than emotional appeals, that patience can be a more powerful tool than immediate reaction. It means having faith that truth ultimately prevails even when the immediate situation seems hopeless, even when everyone seems convinced of your guilt, even when the path to vindication seems impossible to see from your current position of isolation and accusation. It means being willing to endure temporary suffering and injustice for the sake of achieving complete and undeniable vindication, rather than settling for creating just enough doubt to avoid immediate consequences while leaving lingering questions about what really happened. My experience taught me that integrity isn't just about what you do when people are watching. It's about who you are when you're alone and afraid and facing the possibility that you might not be able to prove your innocence despite knowing it with absolute certainty. It's about maintaining your standards and your honesty, even when lies would be easier or more immediately beneficial. About doing the right thing, even when the right thing is difficult and painful and requires sacrifice. It's about believing in justice and truth and the fundamental fairness of well-designed processes, even when your immediate experience seems to contradict those beliefs and tempt you toward cynicism or despair. I share this story with you today not just to recount what happened to me, but to offer hope and guidance to anyone who has faced false accusations, workplace betrayal, or situations where your integrity and reputation are under attack from people who don't share your commitment to honesty and fairness. I want you to know that you can survive these experiences, that truth can prevail, that patience and preparation and strategic thinking can lead to vindication that is more complete and satisfying than any immediate defense could achieve. I want you to understand that silence used strategically can be a powerful tool rather than a sign of weakness or guilt, that sometimes the best response to accusations is to gather evidence and wait for the right moment, rather than reacting emotionally in ways that might undermine your credibility or distract from the facts. Have you ever been falsely accused of something serious? Have you faced workplace betrayal or situations where your reputation was under attack? How did you handle it? What strategies did you use? What did you learn from the experience? I really want to hear your stories in the comments below because I believe we learn from sharing these experiences, from understanding that we're not alone in facing injustice and adversity, from supporting each other through the difficult journey of maintaining integrity in a world that sometimes seems to reward deception and manipulation. Your experience might help someone else who is going through something similar right now, someone who feels alone and afraid and unsure whether justice will ultimately prevail, someone who needs to hear that patience and truth and strategic thinking can lead to vindication even in the darkest moments. If this story resonated with you, if it touched something in your own experience or gave you hope or perspective on your own challenges, please leave a like on this video because it helps me know that sharing these difficult and personal experiences is worthwhile and valuable to others who might benefit from hearing them. Understanding the importance of timing, evidence, and strategic patience in defending yourself against false accusations is crucial not just for surviving these experiences, but for ensuring that justice is served and truth prevails in ways that are complete and undeniable. Please subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales for more stories like this, real experiences of people navigating difficult situations, facing adversity, and ultimately finding their way to truth and justice through patience, courage, and strategic thinking. We share these stories not to entertain but to educate, to support, to remind you that you're not alone in your struggles, and to provide practical insights and emotional encouragement for anyone facing similar challenges. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story that might offer exactly the perspective or guidance you need in your own journey through whatever difficulties you're currently facing. Thank you for being here, for listening to my story, for being part of this community that believes in the power of truth and the importance of sharing our experiences to help others navigate their own challenges with wisdom and courage and hope for ultimate vindication and justice.